Firstly, welcome everybody to this joint Socialist Party and Socialist Students All London meeting on the current economic crisis. I'd like to introduce Hannah Sell, the Deputy General Secretary of the Socialist Party, who will be explaining the roots of this crisis and the socialist alternative. Hannah will speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll have opportunity for questions and discussion after that. So I'd like to welcome Hannah to introduce.
Thank you, James, very much, and thank you to the London Socialist Party and London Socialist Students for inviting me to speak at this meeting tonight. It's traditional for us to have meetings like this at this time of year. I've probably spoken at hundreds of meetings of this kind because the university year is starting, young people are arriving, thinking about ideas, and we want to take the opportunity to say to them, Marx was right, socialism is the way forward, and you should join with us in fighting for socialism. But while we've had many meetings of this kind, the meetings that we're organising this year are completely different to anything in my experience, and I've been an active socialist for over 20 years, and actually in many senses completely different to anything that even the older socialists in the room, who've maybe been active for half a century or so, have ever experienced, because of the profound changes that are taking place in the world economy and the consequences that they are going to have. The era of unregulated, unrestrained, neoliberal capitalism, which we have all lived through for the last 20 years or more, many of you for your whole lives, that era has come to an end. It's over. Its ideological foundations have been shattered. Now at this point, the numbers who've decided that therefore socialism is the way forward, have decided that Karl Marx was right, are still a small minority, although a growing minority. But there's no question that their numbers are going to grow exponentially in the course of the coming years and decade or so. Now that will partly be because of the arguments that socialists put, that people like the Socialist Party put in meetings like this up and down the country. But actually, it will be primarily because of people's own experience of capitalism, of what is taking place at the moment. Already, socialism and Marxism, if not its content, the words are becoming well known again. And that isn't mainly because of the posters that we stick up saying capitalism in crisis, was Marx right, although actually today, the Bank of England did phone the Socialist Party office to complain that we've been sticking posters on some property that belonged to them. What they were annoyed about wasn't the fact we've been sticking posters up, but the posters said, make the bosses pay for the economic crisis, which they were particularly irritated over. But all the same, it isn't mainly us sticking posters up that makes the difference. It's other figures, actually, other than ourselves, who are raising the ideas of socialism. After all, last week the Archbishop of Canterbury even concluded that Marx had been right after all. He went on to say, well, he was right about economic crisis, but about virtually nothing else. So he didn't want to get too closely associated with Karl Marx. Other figures in the Church of England have gone even further. The Bishop of York actually spoke and said the 700 billion proposed rescue deal that Paulson's been trying to get through the US Congress shows how world poverty could be got rid of. And he pointed out that for the cost of $5 billion, you could save the lives of 6 million starving children worldwide. So he'd obviously drawn another conclusion that Marx had, which is that the point is not only to interpret the world, but also to struggle to change it. He called the short sellers, the city fat cats, bank robbers and asset strippers. However, as at the time he was speaking to a dinner of the worshipful company of international bankers, his speech didn't go down quite as well as perhaps it would have done in this meeting tonight. And in fact, of course, the Church of England actually have a lot of money invested in hedge funds, the city and all the rest of it. But it's not mainly even the Church of England that are repopularising socialist ideas, or the word socialism and Marxism. It's an even more strange-seeming source, which James has referred to in his introduction. And that's what's taking place in the United States of America, the most powerful capitalist country on the planet, which has had in George Bush and his co-thinkers one of the most right-wing neoliberal governments in US history. And it's there that the ideas, or not the ideas yet, but the words of socialism and Marxism are being raised again. After all, I don't know how many of you followed the debate in the Republican Congress, which voted down this Paulson plan, which is to give up to $700 billion to bail out the US banks. But the language they were using was incredible. They were talking about socialism, saying this is socialism that's being introduced, we can't have it. We're becoming a communist country, the commanding heights of the economy are being taken over. They even brought the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Party into it. Just to give one quote, one member of the Congress said, "It's always been the temptation in a crisis to sacrifice liberty for short-term promises of prosperity. And it was no mistake that during the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the slogan was peace, land and bread. Today you are being asked to choose between bread and freedom. I suggest that the people on Main Street have said that they prefer their freedom, and I am with them." Now, of course, it's complete nonsense. The Russian Revolution, no matter how it degenerated later, in its inception, was a fight for bread and for freedom against a brutal Tsarist dictatorship. And the reality is that the Paulson plan was not socialism or anything like it. It would be more accurate to call it, and it's been called this by an economist called Nouriel Roubini, who is a right-wing economist, but like ourselves was one of the few people who accurately saw what was taking place in the world economy and what was likely to develop. And he said, this is socialism for the rich and for Wall Street. He said it's privatising the profits and nationalising the losses. And that's the reality of what is taking place in the US at the moment. But if you look at why those Republican Congress people were forced to vote it down, that was because of the enormous anger that exists in US society. 2 million Americans have already lost their homes. 10 million are expected to lose their homes in total. Those people are sitting, facing that, facing losing their jobs, and then they're watching the Congress being asked to vote for $700 billion in order to bail out the banking system, which is not nationalisation, it's just giving the money to the banks. Paulson wasn't even proposing that they take shares in the banks. It was literally just handing the money over, even the figure, by the way. There was one assistant to Paulson who was asked, how did you come up with the figure of 700 billion? And they said, well, we don't know how much it's going to cost, so we just picked a big number. You know? So they can do that for the banking system, and yet nothing is being done for the millions of people who are faced with losing their home. And if it had been genuine socialist measures that actually help the people who are being forced out on the stones in the US who are losing their houses, then there's no question Main Street would have had a very different reaction. All the same, the fact they had to vote it down is an indication of the anger that exists in the US and that working class people are starting to make their voice heard. There was a big article in the Financial Times, which, the Financial Times, because really it's finance capitalism talking to itself. They don't think any of us read it. So they tell the truth in it considerably more than they do in papers like The Guardian, The Mirror, the other papers that you buy on the high street. And they had a headline in a big article that said, "Class war is back in the USA." And it went on to describe how over the last 20 years in America, the rich have got incredibly rich. I mean, they gave the figure that the average chief executive in the finance sector now in the US earns 275 times that of the average worker. That's a gap between rich and poor, which has never existed in the history of any capitalist country previously. So they described all of that, but they said up until now, and there's a degree of truth in this, that hasn't been expressed in class terms. The kind of American dream that people thought that one day they might be that CEO meant that they put up with the fact that their wages were stagnating or even going down and so on. But this commentator said that period is over. Now the working class is making its voice heard. And in a sense, in a very distorted way, that is what happened in that Congress vote, because those right-wing congressmen and women thought they were going to lose their seats if they didn't reflect the anger, the anger of the population. And the question that will be in their mind